Testing the V1 saliency hypothesis by a V1 model, Part 5, Visual Search Asymmetry. We have seen that this simple example of asymmetry between two visual searches can be easily understood by the absence or presence of iso-orientation suppression on critical bars. And here is another example of visual search asymmetry that's much more subtle. On the left is a circle with a gap among closed circles, and on the right is the opposite, a closed circle among open circles. Each circle is sampled as multiple bars in a particular spatial arrangement. Since our V1 model does not have neurons tuned to such a particular shape of open or closed circles, it's only slightly easier to find the odd circle in the left image than in the right image. It's not obvious why this is the case, or which single V1 mechanism is responsible for this, whether it is due to a difference in the strength of iso-orientation suppression, or in the facilitation between neurons for co-aligned bars, or a combination of multiple V1 mechanisms in a subtle manner. Now, since this subtle example is already observed in behavioral data, it provides a critical test to the V1 saliency hypothesis using our V1 model. So we can ask if the V1 model could demonstrate the same asymmetry. To test this, we submit each of the two images to our V1 model and get the model's responses. And from these responses, we calculate a z-score for each of the bars for the target circle and take the maximum of these z-scores and treat it as the z-score for this circle as a whole, since attention to any bar on this circle is attention to this circle. And we do the same thing to get a z-score for this closed circle in this visual image on the right. And the results are the z-score is 9.7 for the target circle in the left image and is 0.41 for the target circle in the right image. Now, given a subtle behavioral difference between these two search images, the higher z-score of 9.7 suggests that the V1 model is quantitatively quite inaccurate. However, the qualitative order between these two z-scores agrees with the observation that the search is easier for the left image. This agreement is not achieved by tuning the model parameters. We remind ourselves that the model parameters have been fixed by our model calibration procedure to make the model imitate the real V1. Of course, this agreement could be a coincidence, since there is a 50% chance for such a qualitative agreement to occur as to which of these two searches is easier. However, other examples of subtle asymmetries have been observed. In this example, it's easier to search for a pair of convergent lines among pairs of parallel lines than the other way around. Here, it's easier to find a longer line among shorter lines than the reverse. And here, it's easier to find a curved line among straight lines than the reverse. And here, it's easier to find an ellipse among circles than a circle among ellipses. And in all these 5 pairs of searches, the model gives a higher z-score to the easier one in each pair of 2 searches. And so for all these qualitative agreements to happen coincidentally, the chance is much smaller. And these search asymmetries are subtle, and they require multiple V1 mechanisms for contextual inferences to work together to give such outcomes. And except this is an exception, perhaps collinear facilitation alone could explain it. Overall, these agreements between the model and data increase our confidence about the V1 saliency hypothesis. Here is another example of visual search asymmetry. It's more difficult to find a target letter N among its mirror images than the other way around. And this asymmetry cannot be explained by the saliency mechanisms in V1. In each image, the target differs from the non-targets only in terms of the orientation of their tilted line components. These lines can obviously evoke V1 responses. The target has a uniquely tilted line in each image and should be salient by V1 mechanisms, since this unique line escapes the iso-orientation suppression. So the search should be easy and fast. The two types of tilted lines are mirror images of each other. In V1, this mirror symmetry is not broken. Then what causes the asymmetry in behavior? It turns out that if we track observers' eye movements during their search and measure the response time or reaction time, RT, for their eye gaze position to reach the target, then there's no asymmetry in these RTs. These eye position RTs are also quite short, since the target location is quite salient.
The total time it takes for the search task for the observer to report that they have found the target includes a saliency component and a non-saliency component. And this non-saliency component can come from object recognition, decision-making, strategy, etc. And from the book and the original literature, you can see that there is a mirror reflection invariance in object recognition, and this invariance confuses the target as a non-target. And this confusion often occurs when the eye gaze position reaches the target, and then the gaze often abandons the target to continue to search elsewhere before it eventually comes back to the target and realizes that this is indeed a target. And this confusion substantially increases this non-saliency component. When the saliency component can be approximated by the RT for the gaze to reach the target, we can then dissect that the search asymmetry is actually in the non-saliency component, and so this asymmetry does not falsify the V1 saliency hypothesis. And this example also demonstrates that sometimes behavioral measurements do not approximate well as manifestations of a particular underlying mechanism that we like to study. Object invariance by a reflection or rotation, and our familiarity with the generic view of an object, such as this letter N viewed from a familiar viewpoint and from an unfamiliar viewpoint, can create a whole class of examples of visual search asymmetry. Here is another example. It's more difficult to find an elephant standing upright among upside-down elephants than to do it the other way around. And it's faster for us to recognize from a familiar viewpoint, and this makes it faster and easier to trigger a confusion of the target as a non-target by rotation or reflection invariance in object recognition. In the three stages of vision, visual saliency concerns selection or looking, object recognition concerns decoding or seeing, and in these examples of visual search, the seeing stage plays a substantial role in the time it takes for the search task.